Hi. We're going to read the first part of chapter 22 today. But before that, I've mentioned several different kinds of crafts as we've been reading this, and I wanted to show you some beads, just very small black beads, but they are made out of rose petals, and these were made by my grandmother Dora Neal. I've got some rose petals from a large rose vine, actually, in Kentucky. And I'm hoping to make my own rose petal beads here pretty soon. And if I get them done, I'll share them with you. Now, A Day of Rest by Edna Creekmore Carmen. And the picture that goes with this of two little kids snuggled in bed. Chapter 22. Bert, you're on my side. Scoot over. I'm over. You're touching me. I ain't. Yes, you are. Susan gave Bert a push. Don't, squealed Bert. That's where Aunt Mary sleeps. Even at his dad's suggestion, nothing would get Bert to sleep on the side of the bed where Aunt Mary slept. He pushed Susan back with more success. Susan fell to the floor with a clunk. Oh, you hurt me. Susan started to whimper, then stopped. There was a slow shuffling of feet on the living room floor. Aunt Mary was coming. A pause in the footsteps. Then the bedroom door opened. Susan slowly straightened up as Aunt Mary walked in. Bert rolled over, expecting to be told in no uncertain terms to get out of that bed immediately. But Aunt Mary only stood looking at the two children in silence, stern but thoughtful. Her eyes slid to the window. They paused a moment when she saw that the screen was unfastened. Slowly, she walked across the room to the window. She fastened the screen and pulled down the window before turning back to look at the dirty boy lying in her bed and at the girl standing fearfully at the side. The tramping feet in the attic were coming down the stairs. Aunt Mary moved quickly to the door, opened it, and then closed it softly before turning to face the men as they opened the attic door. Susan stood looking at the closing door in wonder. A miracle had happened. Aunt Mary hadn't scolded them. She had not said a word. They certainly were lucky. Maybe everything would work out. But what should she do? Get in bed immediately, that was sure. But where? If she touched Bert, she could get dirty, and Aunt Mary might make her take another bath. Susan had scarcely straightened out on Aunt Mary's side of the bed when, with much tramping of feet, the voices of the strangers approached the bedroom door. Where does that door lead to? Mr. Waters asked. My bedroom, Aunt Mary said scathingly. Do you expect Mr. McTay to be hiding under my bed? Now, Mrs. McTay, Mr. Lewis said soothingly, we're just doing our duty. If we check the room, I'm sure we won't find anything wrong, but then we can give you a good report. And why should I want a good report from the likes of you? Bitter though she obviously was, Aunt Mary opened the door and the two men tramped in. The sheriff left the rocker in the living room where he had been sitting and came to the bedroom door, but did not enter. He watched the men as Mr. Lewis crossed the room to the closet door and opened it, and Mr. Waters checked under the bed. Susan edged over close to Bert. She still didn't want to get dirty, but even less did she want to get sprayed with buckshot and the way Aunt Mary was standing, she was in the line of fire between Aunt Mary and the closet where both men were now checking the clothes hanging from the bar. There was nothing else in that closet but some old clothes packed in boxes pushed back in the far end. But from the look on Aunt Mary's face, she was so angry that she was prepared to give the men both barrels of the gun at once. Susan's movement caused the men to turn toward the bed, where Bert and Susan lay with the sheets pulled up to their chins. "Both children sleep with you?" Mr. Lewis commented, turning back to close the closet door. "That makes a bed full," Mr. Waters added as he lifted the sheet and peered under the bed. "Is that any of your business?" Aunt Mary questioned gruffly. "No, ma'am, it isn't any of our business," Mr. Lewis stated. "We'll check the outside now." The two men banged around on the back porch for a while. Then Susan heard their voices fade as they went toward the garage. She at first thought that they were leaving, but the sheriff had brought them, and he was still in the living room, talking with Aunt Mary about the garden. "There's Doug," the sheriff said with relief as he heard a heavy step on the back porch. He said nothing else, although he wondered why Doug was milking so late. Douglas had not been milking. When he left Cal and Jim outside the bedroom window, after telling the two boys to go home, Douglas ran to the barn to help Margaret. But before he reached the barn, Margaret had finished milking Gertie Guernsey, and when Doug opened the barn gate, she was standing in the barn hallway with a bucket of milk in each hand. Margaret had a puzzled look on her face as she turned to face Doug. "I was wondering how I was going to carry 2 buckets of milk and the lantern also." "We don't need the lantern," Doug said, before hurriedly adding, without preamble, "Margaret, I know how you can put Cal through college." "What?" "If you rent your house, you will have the money to put Cal through college." "If I rent the house, what becomes of us?" "I've been planning to put a dormer in the attic for Bert. If I put 2 up there, Cal and Jim can sleep up there also." "Where will I sleep?" "With me, of course." "Douglas McTay, what are you talking about?" "I'm talking about us getting married." Taking advantage of the fact that both of Margaret's arms were held down to her side by the 2 milk buckets she was holding, and she could not hold him off, Doug put his arms around her and kissed her firmly. Doug's heart was beating rapidly as he took a deep breath and stepped back to look questioningly at Margaret. "Will you?" Margaret was irritated that any man would propose to a woman dressed in her oldest dress, with her hair brushed out of shape by the beatings of the cow's tail. The fact that she stood in the barn holding 2 buckets of milk was added irritation. But she wasn't fool enough to say no when she wanted to marry Douglas McTay very much. So she said, "Yes." "That's good," Doug nodded as he took the milk buckets. "Jim and Bert?" Margaret questioned as Doug turned toward the gate. "They're fine," Doug replied casually. "I thought they must be when I saw you," Margaret said thankfully. "I sent Jim home along with Cal," Doug added, but said no more as they walked up through the orchard toward the house, and Margaret was beginning to think she had dreamed the whole proposal when Doug stopped and turned to face her. "There's something odd going on, Margaret. Federal agents are nosing around the place. I don't want you to get involved. You go home now. When the agents leave, bring Jim and Cal back for supper, and we can talk." Before Margaret could object, Doug hurried on and soon was stepping up on the back porch, headed for the back door. "I'll have to go back to the barn to do Bert's work," Doug said as Aunt Mary, followed by the sheriff, came into the kitchen where he was straining the milk. "He's in there in my bed," Aunt Mary said savagely, "as dirty as if he had wallowed in the pig pen." "So that's where he ran off to. I wouldn't have expected it of him." Doug paused, as if thinking out a problem. "I certainly could use some help. But if he's that sleepy that he would crawl into your bed, he wouldn't be any use to me at the barn." Turning to the sheriff, Doug continued, "Well, Floyd, are you courting Aunt Mary, or did you come to see me?" And that's where we're going to stop for now.